July 1518, Strasbourg, France. A woman named Frau Trophia steps into the street and begins to dance. She doesn't stop. For 6 days straight, she dances without rest, her feet bleeding, her body collapsing from exhaustion. But she keeps dancing. Within a week, 34 others have joined her. Within a month, 400 people are dancing uncontrollably through the streets of Strasbourg. They dance for weeks. They dance until their feet are destroyed. They dance until their hearts give out. And then they die, still dancing. The dancing plague of 1518 is one of history's most disturbing medical mysteries. A mass hysteria event so severe that it killed dozens of people through sheer physical exhaustion. No disease, no poison, no logical explanation. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this medieval nightmare terrifies psychologists more than any other mass hysteria event, why it could happen again in our modern world, and why the authorities' response made everything catastrophically worse. But first, if psychological mysteries that challenge our understanding of the human mind fascinate you, hit that subscribe button. What you're about to witness will make you question the control you have over your own body. Strasbourg, 1518. The city sits on the border between France and the Holy Roman Empire, a prosperous trading center of about 20,000 inhabitants. But beneath this prosperity lies a city under siege by disaster. The region has been devastated by famine, disease, and crop failures. Ergot, a toxic fungus that grows on rye grain, has contaminated food supplies. Syphilis epidemics have ravaged the population. The church preaches that these catastrophes are divine punishment for sin. It's July 14th, 1518. The summer heat is oppressive. In this atmosphere of fear, hunger, and religious anxiety, something impossible begins to happen. A woman named Frau Trophia walks into a narrow street and begins to dance. Contemporary records don't describe music. No festival, no obvious trigger. She simply starts dancing first. Onlookers assume she's drunk or mentally disturbed. But as hours pass and Frau Trophia continues dancing with increasing desperation, people begin to realize something is terribly wrong. She dances through the day. She dances through the night. Her husband pleads with her to stop. She cannot. Her feet begin to bleed. She collapses from exhaustion. But as soon as she has the strength, she rises and continues dancing. By the third day, Frau Trophia is still dancing. By the sixth day, witnesses report that she appears to be in a trance state, her eyes vacant, her movements jerky and uncontrolled, like a puppet being manipulated by invisible strings. But the true nightmare is just beginning. Within a week, 34 other people have joined her in the streets. They dance together but not in coordination, each person locked in their own private compulsion, unable to stop, unable to explain why they're dancing. Within a month, the number has grown to approximately 400 people. They dance in the streets, in the squares, in their homes. They dance until their feet are shredded, until they collapse unconscious, until their hearts give out from the exertion. Contemporary records suggest that approximately 15 people per day were dying from the dancing at the height of the outbreak. Not from disease, not from injury, but simply from exhaustion, heart attacks, and strokes brought on by continuous dancing for days or weeks without rest. If you're already feeling the psychological horror of what happened in Strasbourg, show some love with a like. This is just the beginning of how disturbing and medically baffling this event really is. What makes the dancing plague so historically credible is that it was extensively documented by contemporary witnesses, physicians, and civic authorities. This wasn't folklore or legend, it was a real medical emergency that overwhelmed a major European city. The physician Paracelsus, Though he didn't witness the event directly, documented accounts from survivors and witnesses. He described the dancers as being tormented by St. Vitus's dance, a condition associated with uncontrollable movement. Daniel Specklin, a city chronicler, recorded detailed observations. Many persons, both men and women, danced in such a manner for several weeks day and night without ceasing, until they fell down senseless, and many died thereof. Sebastian Brandt, a notable Strasbourg humanist, provided one of the most detailed accounts. He described how the afflicted danced day and night until they fell down from exhaustion and then were carried away to recover. But the most chilling details come from civic records, actual city council minutes documenting the crisis. These records show that Strasbourg's authorities were completely overwhelmed by the outbreak and took increasingly desperate measures to contain it. The city council records state, "Many people, both men and women, were seized by a sudden desire to dance and were unable to control themselves." Witnesses described the dancers' appearance as horrifying. Their faces were contorted, their eyes wild or vacant. Some screamed while they danced, others wept. Still others appeared to be in a trance state, completely unaware of their surroundings. Their movements weren't graceful or coordinated. Witnesses described jerking, spasmodic motions, people thrashing and convulsing rather than dancing in any traditional sense. Physicians who examined the dancers noted that many had swollen feet covered in blood. Some had fractured bones from falls. Others showed signs of severe dehydration and malnutrition because they couldn't stop dancing long enough to eat or drink properly. Yet despite obvious physical distress, the afflicted could not stop. Those who collapsed from exhaustion would often resume dancing as soon as they regained consciousness. It was as if their bodies were no longer under their own control. Here's what I find most terrifying. These people wanted to stop. They were aware they were harming themselves, but they physically could not stop dancing. What does this say about the control we actually have over our own bodies? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Faced with a medical crisis they couldn't understand, Strasbourg's authorities made decisions that would turn a tragic situation into a full-blown catastrophe. Initially, the city council consulted physicians who diagnosed the problem as hot blood, a medical theory based on the humoral system that dominated medieval medicine. The prescribed treatment was simple: more dancing. The physicians reasoned that the afflicted had too much heated blood that needed to be expelled through vigorous physical activity. If the dancers were forced to continue dancing, the theory went, they would eventually purge the bad humors from their system and recover. So the city council made a decision that seems insane in retrospect. They decided to encourage the dancing. The authorities hired professional musicians and dancers. They constructed stages in public squares. They opened guild halls to provide more space for the afflicted to dance. They literally institutionalized and facilitated the very behavior that was killing people. Imagine the nightmare. Hundreds of people convulsing and thrashing in the streets while musicians played continuously and professional dancers demonstrated proper form, all under the belief that this would cure the affliction. The result was predictable and horrific. Instead of burning itself out, the dancing plague spread. More people joined the compulsive dancing. The death toll mounted. The situation spiraled completely out of control. This might be the most catastrophic public health intervention in recorded history, authorities literally prescribing more of the thing that was killing people, based on medieval medical theory that was completely wrong. After approximately 2 weeks of this disastrous policy, the authorities finally recognized that their intervention was making things worse. They abruptly reversed course, banned all public music and dancing, and expelled the afflicted from the city. The church, viewing the outbreak as divine punishment, organized religious processions and pilgrimages to shrines dedicated to St. Vitus, the patron saint invoked against dancing mania. The afflicted were taken to St. Vitus's chapel at Saverne, where priests performed exorcisms and prayer ceremonies. And then, just as mysteriously as it had begun, the dancing plague ended. By September 1518, the compulsive dancing had stopped. Survivors recovered. The city returned to normal. But approximately 15 to 40 people had died, killed by a compulsion to dance that no one could explain and no one could stop. The question that has haunted historians and medical researchers for over 500 years is simple. Why? What caused hundreds of people to dance themselves to death? One of the most popular scientific explanations for the dancing plague is ergot poisoning, specifically contamination of rye grain with the fungus Claviceps purpurea. Ergot contains several psychoactive alkaloids, including ergotamine, which is a precursor to LSD. When consumed in contaminated grain, ergot can cause a condition called ergotism, historically known as St. Anthony's fire. The symptoms of ergotism include convulsions, hallucinations, muscle spasms, and in severe cases, gangrene of the extremities due to vasoconstriction. Medieval Europe experienced numerous ergotism outbreaks, particularly during periods of wet weather that promoted fungal growth on crops. The summer of 1518 followed a period of famine and crop failures. Desperate populations would have eaten contaminated grain that they might normally have rejected. The conditions were perfect for an ergotism outbreak. Ergot's convulsive effects could theoretically explain the uncontrollable movements of the dancers. The hallucinations could explain their trance-like state. The theory seems to fit. But here's why the ergot theory doesn't fully explain the dancing plague. Ergotism typically causes people to writhe and convulse, but not to dance in a coordinated manner for days or weeks. The movements described in historical accounts don't match ergotism's typical symptoms. Furthermore, ergotism usually affects entire communities that share the same food supply. But the dancing plague affected specific individuals in Strasbourg while leaving their families unaffected, even though they would have eaten from the same grain supplies. Most importantly, ergotism causes extreme pain and often results in gangrene. Victims typically become incapacitated and bedridden, not capable of dancing vigorously for days or weeks. The physical endurance demonstrated by the Strasbourg dancers is completely inconsistent with severe ergotism. While ergot contamination may have been present in Strasbourg in 1518 and might have contributed to the atmosphere of fear and stress, it cannot fully explain the dancing plague's specific characteristics. We need to look elsewhere for answers. The most widely accepted scientific explanation among modern researchers is mass psychogenic illness, also known as mass hysteria. But this isn't just medieval superstition. It's a well-documented psychological phenomenon that continues to occur in modern times. Dr. John Waller, a medical historian who wrote the definitive study of the dancing plague, argues that the outbreak was a form of stress-induced mass hysteria triggered by extreme psychological trauma. Consider the context. Strasbourg in 1518 was a population under extreme stress. Years of famine had caused widespread malnutrition. Disease epidemics had killed thousands. The church preached that these disasters were God's punishment for sin. The people of Strasbourg were literally starving, terrified, and convinced that divine wrath was imminent. They existed in a state of constant psychological trauma. But here's what makes the dancing plague specifically a dancing phenomenon. Medieval German culture had a long-standing belief in dance frenzies caused by St. Vitus or other saints as punishment for sin. There were established cultural narratives about compulsive dancing as divine punishment. People had heard stories, seen paintings, and internalized the idea that sinners could be cursed to dance uncontrollably. When Frau Trophia began dancing, she wasn't consciously choosing to fake an illness. She was experiencing a genuine dissociative state, a psychological break triggered by overwhelming stress in which her body began acting out culturally expected behaviors without conscious control. Once others witnessed her dancing and heard it attributed to Saint Vitus's curse, the stage was set for social contagion. People who were already under extreme stress saw an acceptable way to express their psychological anguish through uncontrollable dancing that was culturally recognized as divine punishment, not personal weakness. This pattern of stress-induced mass hysteria continues to occur in modern times. In the 1960s, a Tanzanian school experienced an outbreak where students couldn't stop laughing for months. In the 1990s, factory workers in Asian textile facilities experienced mass fainting epidemics. The mass hysteria theory explains why the dancing plague affected specific individuals rather than entire households. It explains why it spread through observation and social contact. It explains why it resolved when the afflicted were removed from the triggering environment. But here's what should terrify you about the mass hysteria explanation. If extreme stress could make hundreds of medieval people dance themselves to death, what could modern stress do to our psychologically fragile society? What would a mass hysteria event look like in the age of social media? Share your thoughts in the comments. The dancing plague of 1518 wasn't unique. It was the largest and best documented example of a phenomenon that occurred repeatedly throughout medieval and early modern Europe, suggesting this was a genuine psychological syndrome, not a one-time mystery. The Aachen dancing epidemic of 1374, more than a century before Strasbourg, the German city of Aachen experienced a similar outbreak. Hundreds of people danced through the streets, forming chains and circles, dancing for hours or days until collapsing from exhaustion. This outbreak spread to other cities across the Low Countries and into Germany. Contemporary chronicles describe dancers traveling from town to town, spreading the compulsion wherever they went. The epidemic was so severe that churches held special services to treat the afflicted, and civil authorities issued proclamations banning dancing to prevent further spread. The 1278 dancing bridge incident in Maastricht, Netherlands, in 1278, approximately 200 people began dancing on a bridge over the Meuse River. They danced so vigorously that the bridge collapsed, drowning many of the dancers. What makes this incident particularly disturbing is that witnesses reported the dancers continued dancing even as the bridge began to collapse, as if they were unable to respond to obvious mortal danger. The 1237 Children's Crusade dance in Erfurt, Germany, in 1237, over 100 children began dancing and couldn't stop. They danced through the streets and out of the city, collapsing along the roads. Some died from exhaustion. These recurring outbreaks share common features. They occurred during periods of social stress, famine, plague, war. They primarily affected lower-class populations under extreme duress, and they involved culturally specific expressions of psychological distress. The Tarantism phenomenon. Southern Italy experienced a related phenomenon called Tarantism from the 15th through 17th centuries. People believed they had been bitten by tarantula spiders and could only be cured by dancing for hours or days to specific music. Tarantism differed from the Northern European dancing plagues in that it was culturally institutionalized. Communities had specific rituals, music, and healing practices for tarantella dancing. But the underlying psychology was similar: stress-induced dissociative states expressed through culturally prescribed dance behavior. These repeated outbreaks across centuries and regions prove that the dancing plague wasn't a unique mystery but a pattern of human psychological response to extreme stress, a pattern that could potentially resurface under the right conditions. The most disturbing question about the dancing plague isn't what caused it in 1518, but whether it could happen again in our modern world. And the uncomfortable answer is absolutely. Mass psychogenic illness hasn't disappeared. It's still occurring, and in some ways, modern technology and social connectivity are making it worse. 2011 Leroy High School outbreak in Leroy, New York, 18 teenage girls at the same high school simultaneously developed tics, seizures, and Tourette's-like symptoms. Extensive medical testing found no physical cause. Researchers eventually concluded it was mass psychogenic illness triggered by social stress and amplified by social media. The girls were posting videos of their symptoms online, watching each other's videos, and unconsciously reinforcing the behavior. Social media created a feedback loop that intensified the outbreak. 2012 Sri Lankan factory outbreak in a Sri Lankan garment factory. Over 1,000 workers experienced mass fainting episodes over several weeks. Medical investigations found no toxic exposure or environmental cause. Researchers concluded it was mass hysteria triggered by poor working conditions, stress, and fear. Social media contagion. Modern psychologists are particularly concerned about how social media might facilitate mass psychogenic illness. When people observe others exhibiting unusual symptoms online, especially if those symptoms receive attention and sympathy, it can trigger unconscious imitation. Consider the psychological stress of modern life: economic anxiety, social media pressure, political polarization, climate change fears, pandemic trauma. We're living in a state of chronic stress that rivals or exceeds the psychological pressures faced by medieval populations. Now imagine a mass hysteria event spreading through TikTok or Instagram. Millions of people watching videos of others exhibiting strange symptoms, unconsciously internalizing and replicating the behavior, creating a global outbreak of psychogenic illness in days or hours instead of weeks or months. Dr. Robert Bartholomew, a medical sociologist who studies mass hysteria, warns that modern society is actually more vulnerable to mass psychogenic illness than medieval populations because of increased social connectivity and reduced face-to-face community support. We're more connected but more isolated, more informed but more anxious, more visible but more insecure. These are perfect conditions for mass psychological contagion. The dancing plague wasn't caused by demons, curses, or supernatural forces. It was caused by human psychology responding to unbearable stress. And human psychology hasn't changed in 500 years. Only the stressors have. The dancing plague of 1518 offers profound lessons about human psychology, social contagion, and how authorities respond to crises they don't understand. Unfortunately, we keep repeating the same mistakes. Lesson 1. Authorities often make things worse. Strasbourg's authorities, faced with a crisis they couldn't understand, implemented policies that amplified the very problem they were trying to solve. They hired musicians and built dance floors, literally encouraging the behavior that was killing people. This pattern repeats throughout history. During mass hysteria events, authorities often implement responses based on misunderstanding that make the situation worse. Recognition of the pattern is the first step toward better crisis management. Lesson 2. Stress has physical consequences. The dancing plague proves that psychological stress can manifest in severe physical symptoms. The dancers weren't faking. They were experiencing genuine dissociative states triggered by unbearable psychological pressure. Modern medicine recognizes this through conditions like conversion disorder, where psychological stress manifests as physical symptoms. But we still struggle to take psychological distress as seriously as physical illness. Lesson 3. Culture shapes how stress manifests. Medieval Germans expressed extreme stress through compulsive dancing because that was a culturally available narrative. Modern populations might express the same stress through different symptoms: chronic fatigue, mysterious illnesses, or other culturally recognized forms of distress. This means we can't predict what form a modern mass hysteria event might take. It will express itself through whatever cultural narratives are currently available and socially accepted. Lesson 4. Social contagion is real. The dancing plague spread through observation and social contact. Modern technology has made social contagion infinitely more powerful and faster spreading. We're connected to millions of people simultaneously, creating unprecedented potential for psychological contagion. Perhaps most importantly, the dancing plague teaches us that human psychology has limits. Push people beyond those limits through chronic stress, fear, and trauma, and they will break in unpredictable and sometimes catastrophic ways. Medieval Strasbourg pushed its population beyond psychological endurance through famine, disease, and religious terror. The dancing plague was the result. What psychological breaking points are we approaching in modern society? What will be our dancing plague? The dancing plague of 1518 stands as one of history's most disturbing medical mysteries, not because we don't know what caused it, but because we do, and the implications are terrifying. Hundreds of people danced themselves to death because psychological stress exceeded their capacity to cope, and cultural narratives gave that stress a specific form of expression. There was no supernatural cause, no poison, no disease, just human psychology pushed beyond its breaking point. The dancing plague teaches us that the human mind is more fragile than we like to admit. Under sufficient stress, we can lose control of our own bodies, acting out behaviors we can't stop even when we know they're harming us. And perhaps most disturbing of all, we're creating the exact conditions that could trigger a modern dancing plague. Chronic stress, social isolation, cultural trauma, and instant global connectivity, all the ingredients are present. The question isn't whether mass psychogenic illness will occur again. The question is what form it will take, how fast it will spread, and whether we'll recognize it in time to prevent catastrophe. If this deep dive into one of history's most disturbing psychological mysteries has made you rethink what the human mind is capable of under stress, smash that like button and subscribe for more investigations into the darkest corners of human psychology and history. And here's my question for you. If a mass hysteria event started spreading through social media today, what symptoms do you think it would involve? What would be our generation's dancing plague? Share your theories in the comments below. Some of you might be disturbingly accurate. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss it. Until then, remember, the greatest threats to human sanity don't come from the outside world. They come from within our own fragile minds.